Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning and everyone around you has agreed to never speak another word again. No hello, no goodbye, no I love you, no asking for help. Just silence. Sound impossible? Well, there's a village that actually tried this. And what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about human communication. What if I told you that in 1978, an entire community decided that words were poisoning their relationships, that speaking was making them more distant, not closer? They called it the Great Silence, and for nearly 6 months, over 300 people lived without uttering a single syllable. This isn't some made-up story or urban legend. This actually happened, and the psychological aftermath was so intense that researchers are still studying it today. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. They weren't trying to punish themselves. They genuinely believed they were evolving into something better, something more pure. And for a while, it seemed like they might be right. Let me take you back to Harmony Ridge, a small intentional community nestled in the mountains of Northern California. Founded in the early 1970s by a group of former academics and spiritual seekers, this wasn't your typical hippie commune. These were educated people, former professors, psychologists, and researchers who had grown disillusioned with what they saw as the corruption of modern society. The community was led by Dr. Miranda Ashworth, a former linguistic professor at Berkeley who had become fascinated by the idea that human language was actually holding back our emotional and spiritual development. She had spent years studying how different cultures communicated, and she became convinced that our reliance on spoken words was creating barriers between people instead of connecting them. Think about it for a second. How many times have you said something you didn't mean? How often have your words been misunderstood? How frequently do you find yourself talking just to fill awkward silence, saying nothing of real value? Dr. Ashworth believed these problems weren't bugs in the system. They were features of language itself. Her theory was radical. Human beings had evolved sophisticated nonverbal communication long before we developed speech. In her view, spoken language was a relatively recent evolutionary mistake that was actually making us less connected, not more. She pointed out how babies and their mothers communicated before language developed, how people in love could often understand each other without words, how some of the most profound moments in life happened in silence. The community had been experimenting with periods of silence for months. They started with silent Sundays, then extended to silent weekends. Members reported feeling more connected, more present, more aware of subtle emotional cues they had been missing. They felt like they were rediscovering a lost human capacity. So when Dr. Ashworth proposed a great silence, a complete elimination of spoken language for an extended period, the community was ready. They spent weeks preparing, developing an elaborate system of hand signals, written communication protocols, and nonverbal interaction methods. They created detailed schedules, emergency procedures, and ways to handle complex situations without speaking. On March 15, 1978, at exactly sunrise, 307 people stopped talking. The first few days were awkward, almost comical. People kept opening their mouths to speak before catching themselves. There were lots of frustrated gestures, confused looks, and people writing furious notes to each other. The children, especially, struggled with the transition. Some of the younger kids couldn't understand why the adults had suddenly stopped responding to their questions. But something remarkable began to happen after the first week. The community started to slow down. Without the constant chatter that fills most human interactions, people became more deliberate in their movements, more thoughtful in their actions. They paid attention to facial expressions, body language, and subtle emotional cues that they had previously ignored. Meals became elaborate rituals of shared attention, without conversation to distract them. People actually tasted their food, noticed how others were eating, picked up on moods and feelings that would normally be hidden behind polite dinner talk. Work projects became synchronized dances where people anticipated each other's needs without having to ask. The written communication system evolved rapidly. What started as simple notes grew into a complex literary culture. People wrote poetry to each other, left elaborate illustrated messages, created visual art that conveyed emotional states. The community's walls became covered with an ever-changing gallery of human expression. Children adapted faster than adults. developing their own intricate sign language that was far more nuanced than the formal system the adults had created. They invented games that relied entirely on nonverbal cooperation, created stories told through movement and gesture, and seemed to develop an almost telepathic ability to understand each other's needs. But perhaps most significantly, conflicts nearly disappeared. The arguments and disagreements that had occasionally disrupted community harmony simply evaporated. Without the ability to escalate tensions through heated words, people were forced to address problems through action, through demonstration, through patience and understanding rather than confrontation. Dr. Ashworth documented everything meticulously, writing detailed observations about the community's transformation. She noted that people seemed more emotionally available, more present in their interactions, more capable of genuine intimacy. Touch became more important, eye contact more meaningful, shared activities more profound. Visitors to the community during this period described it as almost otherworldly. The silence wasn't empty or oppressive. It was full and rich and alive. People moved together with a kind of choreographed grace, seemed to communicate complex ideas through the smallest gestures, radiated a sense of peace and connection that felt almost supernatural. But as the weeks turned to months, cracks began to appear in this seemingly perfect system. The first major crisis came in week 8 when one of the community members, Sarah Chun, had a severe allergic reaction to something she ate. In the precious minutes, while others tried to understand what was happening and how to help, valuable time was lost. She survived, but barely, and only because a visiting delivery driver happened to arrive and could call for emergency help. This incident shook the community's confidence. They realized that their beautiful, evolved communication system had serious practical limitations. Complex medical information, detailed technical instructions, and urgent warnings were incredibly difficult to convey without speech. They had been living in a kind of paradise, but it was a fragile paradise that couldn't handle certain types of real-world challenges. More problems emerged as the experiment continued. Without the ability to discuss abstract concepts verbally, the community found it increasingly difficult to make collective decisions about their future. Planning sessions became frustratingly slow and often ended in confusion. New members couldn't be properly integrated because the orientation process was too cumbersome without spoken explanation. Some individuals began to show signs of psychological stress. A few members reported feeling increasingly isolated, especially those whose natural communication style relied heavily on verbal expression. Artists and writers in the community felt creatively stifled. People with hearing impairments, who had initially seemed well suited to the experiment, reported that the loss of spoken language actually made communication more difficult for them because it eliminated many auditory cues they relied on. Children, while adapting well to the nonverbal system, began showing delayed development in areas that typically relied on verbal learning. Without the constant input of adult conversation, their vocabulary growth stalled, and their understanding of complex abstract concepts lagged behind typical developmental milestones. The community's relationship with the outside world became increasingly strained. Simple interactions with delivery drivers, government officials, and potential new members became elaborate productions that often ended in frustration for everyone involved. The community was becoming isolated not by choice, but by practical necessity. By month 5, Dr. Ashworth was observing troubling patterns. While many community members still praised the depth and quality of their nonverbal connections, they were also showing signs of what she termed conceptual atrophy. Complex philosophical discussions had essentially ceased. Planning for the future became nearly impossible. The rich intellectual culture that had originally drawn many members to the community was withering away. More concerning were the subtle power dynamics that were emerging. People who were naturally gifted at nonverbal communication, who were physically expressive or artistically talented, began to dominate community interactions. Those who had previously contributed through verbal skills, analytical thinking, or complex reasoning found themselves marginalized. The community was unknowingly creating a new hierarchy based on nonverbal communication ability rather than the democratic ideals they had originally embraced. Some members began cheating. They would sneak away to private areas and whisper to each other, or they would develop coded written communications that were essentially spoken language translated to paper. The pure experiment was breaking down as people desperately sought ways to express ideas that seemed impossible to convey through the approved methods. The end came suddenly and dramatically. During a community meeting in late August, while trying to discuss a serious financial crisis facing the group, frustration reached a breaking point. One member, Robert Martinez, stood up and simply shouted, "This is insane! We need to talk about this." The dam burst. Within minutes, people throughout the room were speaking, some crying, some laughing, some angry, all desperate to use their voices again. The great silence was over. The aftermath was complicated. Many members felt like they had lost something precious and irreplaceable. They talked about missing the profound intimacy they had experienced during the silent months, the way they had learned to really see each other, to pay attention to subtle emotional cues that they now found themselves ignoring again. But they also felt relieved. They could discuss complex ideas again, make plans, share abstract thoughts, teach and learn in ways that had been impossible during the experiment. Children could ask questions and get immediate answers. Emergency situations could be handled efficiently. The community could engage with the outside world without elaborate workarounds. Dr. Ashworth published her findings in a controversial paper that sparked debates in linguistic, psychological, and anthropological circles. Her conclusions were nuanced. The experiment had revealed both the profound importance of nonverbal communication in human connection and the essential role that spoken language plays in complex human society. She argued that the modern world had indeed become overly reliant on verbal communication at the expense of other forms of human connection, but that completely eliminating speech was throwing out essential tools for human cooperation and cultural development. The key insight wasn't that words were bad, but that balanced communication, using all available channels, was optimal. The community continued for several more years, incorporating many of the lessons they had learned during the Great Silence. They maintained regular periods of silence, paid much more attention to nonverbal communication, and developed a richer, more multifaceted approach to human connection. But they never again attempted to completely eliminate speech. Looking back at this extraordinary experiment nearly 5 decades later, what strikes researchers most is how it revealed both the potential and the limitations of human communication. The community members did experience something profound during those silent months. They developed deeper awareness, more meaningful connections, and a richer appreciation for nonverbal human expression. But they also discovered that human language, for all its flaws and complications, serves essential functions that cannot be easily replaced. Our ability to discuss abstract concepts, plan for the future, share complex technical information, and build sophisticated cultural institutions depends heavily on our capacity for verbal communication. The village that banned words teaches us that communication is far more complex and multifaceted than we typically realize. In our digital age, where so much interaction happens through text and screens, the lessons of Harmony Ridge feel especially relevant. We might be losing touch with the nonverbal richness that these community members rediscovered, while also becoming overly dependent on shallow forms of verbal and written exchange. Perhaps the real insight isn't about choosing between verbal and nonverbal communication, but about recognizing that human connection works best when all our communication channels are engaged. The profound intimacy that the silent community experience reminds us of what we might be missing in our noisy, chatter-filled world, while their ultimate return to speech reminds us why humans develop language in the first place. The next time you find yourself in conversation, remember Harmony Ridge. Notice not just the words being spoken, but the gestures, the facial expressions, the space between the words. Pay attention to what people are communicating beyond their verbal message, but also appreciate the remarkable human ability to share complex ideas, abstract thoughts, and cultural knowledge through the sophisticated tool of spoken language. In the end, the village that banned words discovered that the richest human communication happens not in silence, not in endless chatter, but in the thoughtful integration of all the ways humans can connect with each other. And that might be the most revolutionary idea of all.